Hello, my name is Jim Aiken, and this is my story of growing up in a rural setting in Kansas, learning that I was gay and coming to terms with that, working as a commuter airline pilot, and retiring in New York City. Even though I grew up in the mid-sized community of Wichita, we had a rural orientation, and my father introduced me to farm life when I was 9 months old, helping with the harvest. And I always enjoyed the company of my father. When my little brother was born, that's me holding the baby with my two older sisters helping. We competed for my little brother's attention. I always had a masculine identification and took on the male role. And again, that's me helping my dad pull the sled with the neighborhood girls along with my sisters one snowy winter when I was about 5 years old. Also, we went camping in Colorado often, and even though we were camping, I seemed to have the need to dress properly while my sisters had casual clothes on as we climbed over the train there in Colorado. When I was 12 years old, we went to visit my uncle in California. He lived in an area north of San Francisco, and he lived with another male companion. And it was explained that the other male companion was a traveling salesman, so he was never there when we visited. But I wondered why they lived in a one-bedroom house with one bed. But, you know, I didn't linger on that too long. At the age of 12, it didn't much matter to me. My uncle had a Volkswagen Bug, and I had been saving my money for 2 years for a motorcycle. But when we rode around those California hills in that little VW Bug, and you could see directly over the hood, directly onto the road, it was like a roller coaster ride all the time, and I just fell in love with the VW Bug. And so I told my uncle that I wanted to switch from saving money for a motorcycle, which I actually had $100 saved up, to a Volkswagen Bug. He didn't tell me how much it cost, but he suggested that I wish upon a star. So every night from then on, I would go out at sunset and wish upon the first star. Little did I know it was probably Venus and not a star at all. That fall, when I approached the age of 13, my parents came to me and said that they had received an offer of me handling a paper route, and was I interested? And I jumped at the chance, and suddenly my income went from $10 a month to $35 a week, and that Volkswagen seemed to be in sight. A year later, at the age of 14, I actually bought a brand new 1967 Volkswagen Bug. I wasn't old enough to drive, but my parents, I think, let me buy it because I was obsessed with the toy truck and played with it all the time, and that's probably not normal for a 14-year-old. So I switched from tearing up the toy truck to taking the wheels off of the VW. I jacked that car up every which way possible and rotated the tires at least once a week. I learned how to take all the seats out and put them back in. I learned how to dismantle everything you could dismantle on that car and then put it back together. So that was kind of my early mechanical training, self-taught. Luckily, I didn't destroy the car. Also, at the same age, I became interested in airplanes, and I didn't know it, but my parents got together. My dad told my mother, well, now he wants to learn how to fly. And I had started pedaling my bicycle to the airport, and I didn't even tell them. It was 8 miles away across 2 highways, and I just went. I thought it was okay. I had my own money, and I could do what I wanted to. And Mom's response to Dad saying that I wanted to learn how to fly was, well, it's safer than a motorcycle. So at the age of 14, I got my $5 together and went to the airport one Saturday and took my first introductory flight lesson in a Cessna 150. When I was 16, I learned how to fly in earnest in that same model of airplane out of Wichita Mid-Continent Airport, now called Eisenhower International, I believe. Anyway, as a high schooler, I traveled with a group of friends from church, and one summer we went down to Beaver Lake, I believe it was called, in Arkansas. And we drove one of the other boys' cars. But I had grown tired of my VW Bug by that time, and I had to have a Camaro. So I bought a brand new 1969 Camaro. So along with paying for 2 brand new cars and paying for my flying lessons, with that paper route, it was quite successful. So my uncle's suggestion of wishing on a star was a good suggestion. I found out later that I also had a gay cousin, and he lived in San Francisco also. And I would go visit both my uncle and my cousin and both of their companions over the years. Unfortunately, both my cousin and my uncle passed away from AIDS. After high school, I wasn't ready to deal with life on life's terms, and so I had the opportunity to become an exchange student, even though I'd already graduated from high school. I went to Antwerp in Belgium and lived with a Dutch family. They had a beautiful townhouse on Koninklijke Lane, and it was 4 stories tall. And my brother and I, host brother, the family that I lived with, didn't share a bedroom, but we shared what's called a duckhoot. And we would sit in our windows on the 4th floor with our feet in the drain, and we could walk back and forth to each other's bedrooms on the roof of the house. Also went hiking in the woods often. Or down the street from where we lived was a beautiful park, and they had sculptures, and there were Hercules and the wrestlers. And I was fascinated because I could see them all in their glory of manhood. Also worked on a farm in Belgium, and everything was done by hand. The other exchange students, one of them, her name was Kay Wong, and that's me photographed there with Kay, and she was from Jamaica, I believe. And in the other photograph is myself, Cindy, Candy Lester, and Margaret, I believe her name was. The last night in Belgium, I had learned how to drink, and I had my bottle of port wine. My host family brothers always teased me because port wine was an old lady's drink. Also had a crush on a young black man from South Africa who was able to escape apartheid and come to live in the Netherlands for a year. We hung out a lot together, and I'm very grateful for our friendship. We both learned to speak Dutch together. One kind of funny story is that I didn't know his native language was English, and I thought the black South Africans spoke Afrikaans, which is similar to Netherlands. And so he and I would speak Netherlands all the time. And one day his host mother came into the living room, and she looked funny at us, and she said, "Why are you boys speaking Dutch?" And I looked at Garth and I said, "I thought that was his native language." And he laughed and said, "No, English is my native language." And then he said, "The reason I speak Dutch to Jim is because he learned to speak how to speak Dutch, and the other American students did not. So out of respect, we communicated in Dutch." When I was in college at age 20, I finally admitted to myself that I was gay. And so rather than dealing with it, I decided to run from it. And I moved from Wichita to Ness City, where I had a group of friends in western Kansas. And I took up farm life full time. I really loved working and living on the farm. It was a wonderful place to be, the open country. And I made very little money, but it was a lot of fun. The people in a small town are each valuable, and so the friends that I acquired took me in and accepted me for just as I was. The countryside was beautiful. The first farmer that I worked for didn't bother getting rid of his dead cows. He just let them rot in the field. At the time, I had a 1970 Volkswagen that I loved driving all over the United States. I went from Kansas to the West Coast one summer and Kansas to the East Coast the next summer. One year, I had no place to live, so I asked a friend if I could set up my teepee in his backyard, and he said yes. And so I lived in an 18-foot teepee from July probably through December, first part of January that year, and teepee became party central in Ness City, and it was quite a gathering place. We also bought a hang glider and taught ourselves to fly the hang glider on the few hills. There was lots of wind, and we really had a good time doing that. During the 4 years I lived in Ness City, I finally came to terms with my sexuality and would sometimes make weekend trips to Wichita, where one Christmas I met a man and fell in love. And at that point, I decided when I graduated from college in Hays, Kansas, to move to Austin, Texas to be with my new boyfriend. One Halloween when I lived in Austin, I dressed as a cowboy just as a remembrance of my time in Nest City when I was a real cowboy. These are some photographs from the internet that depict kind of how I lived. One time we had a gay steer in the feedlot, and the other steers wouldn't let him eat, and they would ride him as if he were a heifer. And so we had to get on the horses and get into the feedlot and cut that gay steer out. And when we finally got him separated, I rode on one of the horses, and when we finally got him separated and into the pen with the heifers, they were all real happy to see him, and he went right up to the food bunker and was able to eat, and all the heifers went up and smelled him and greeted him and welcomed him into the herd. I asked the farmer about it later on, and he said, well, yeah, they're just like people. Some of them are gay. When I moved to Austin, my boyfriend wasn't really prepared to have me there, and it took a while for us to adapt to one another. We had our first apartment about 6 months after I moved to Austin, and it was in the Kirkwood or the Delwood neighborhood. I was still driving my Camaro at the time, and we lived there for about a year. And then we moved to South Austin and on Oakcrest, and it was a very private backyard area with no neighbors, so I was able to take a photograph of my rear end and my puppy's rear end when we lived there. John and I were a very handsome couple, and we often went to events in Austin, like Splash Day out at Lake Travis, where you could go completely nude. We were also photographed for the Gay Rag magazine, This Week in Texas. Eventually, I became a tree surgeon, and we bought a house in 1980. I remember it snowed in 1981, which was very unusual in Austin, even in the deepest, coldest part of the winter. We also went to Dallas often, where John had friends, and had a wonderful time at the state fair. I was definitely a party animal and enjoyed my life in Austin. In 1980, I entered a couple of beauty contests at the local gay bars, and surprisingly won the first. I was Mr. Apartment Lounge, and then I entered the Mr. Blue Boy contest at the Colorado Street bar, and I also won that. And at the time, I went by my stage name, which I had acquired on the farm, Jimmer. And I was featured in This Week in Texas again, and that took me on a wild ride. The winnings was a glass trophy, which was beautiful, that I still have, $500, which obviously I no longer have, and an all-expense paid trip to New York City, where I would participate in the National Blue Boy contest. And of course, I didn't win that one. But it was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed doing it. Also, in 1981, as a result of winning that contest locally in Austin and being featured as a centerfold in Blue Boy magazine in March of 1981, I was offered a job at a local bar called the Private Cellar. I also did drag for the first time. You can see me there in my two-piece bathing suit with my hairband and still wearing a mustache. The Private Cellar was a gay bar on West 6th Street in Austin, Texas. And you can see the advertisement with all the bartenders and Butch the dog, which was our mascot. That's me circled in red. The building was a small building next to Walnut Creek. I had a wonderful time as a bartender and participated in all the cleanup duties, and I had many stories and met wonderful people at the bar. It was a wonderful 4 years of my life. In some ways, it was magical. One year I went on vacation to California and went gold mining with my uncle, and you can see the miner with the beard that helped us find gold. And when I got back to the bar, I took the gold that I found and sprinkled it into little jewelry holders, and I gave about 30 jewelry holders filled with speckles of gold to my customers, because they were all so special to me. And I really, really cherish my time as a bartender in Austin. In 1989, when John and I were breaking up, I met another young man. His name was Stephen, and we became boyfriends and then lovers, and eventually we had a holy union. AIDS service, he was HIV positive, and AIDS Services of Austin one year had a fundraiser called Las Vegas Days, and so we did a mock wedding ceremony in the Las Vegas chapel. That was me with the top hat and coat, and Stephen with the bride's veil and bouquet. Towards the end of his life, we were together 5 years, and towards the end of his life, he became very ill, and it looked like he was going to die. But fortunately, he recovered enough to have an actual holy union, though gay marriage was not allowed at the time in Texas or anywhere in the nation. But afterwards, we went on a cruise to the Caribbean, which was just an absolutely wonderful experience. The doctors had told us that there was a 90% chance that Stephen would die while we were on the cruise. It was a large sailing vessel, and it was very rough and not wheelchair accessible, and it was quite traumatic getting to the ship on the little dinghy with Stephen's wheelchair. But while we were on the ship, Stephen gained over 20 pounds, and by the end of the cruise, he was out of the wheelchair and walking all over the ship, and he even went snorkeling in the Caribbean Ocean. And those are our wedding rings, and you can see in the little map the route. We went to St. Martin, St. Barts, St. Kitts, and Saba, and we sailed on the beautiful Caribbean Ocean, and he got another 2 months of life after that back in Austin, Texas, before he passed away from AIDS in 1994, December of 1994. After my bartending days in 1985, I got a job pumping gas at minimum wage at Austin Robert Mueller Airport. This was a major change in life for me. I had actually gotten my pilot's license when I was in high school in Wichita, but I never really put it to use. And while I worked pumping gas at the airport, I was able, on my minimum wage pay, to purchase a 50% share in a little yellow Piper Tri-Pacer that we call Buttercup. I flew that airplane all over central United States and built quite a bit of flight time. And during that same period of time, I got my commercial and instrument rating and my flight instructor's rating. I loved giving rides to people, and whenever I took people up for an airplane flight, because I understood that people were afraid of flying in small airplanes, I would first tell them that we were only going around the airport one time, and we were going to land immediately. And if at any point they felt uncomfortable, they could tell me, and I would declare an emergency with the tower, and we would land even quicker. But 99% of the time, people loved it, and we got to tour. You can see the photos of Austin. There are 3 photos. One is of the airport. The second one is of Lake Austin, west of Austin, and the third in the stack there is of Austin downtown. I also bought another airplane, a third share, and we called that airplane Gumby. I got my multi-engine rating, my multi-engine instructor and instrument rating in Gumby, and was able to teach flying in Gumby. The photograph of the little orange airplane with the young lady and myself was the day she soloed She later went on to get her private pilot's license, and she also got her multi-engine rating in Gumby. I became a cameraman for an aerial photography outfit, and we flew out of a grass strip in northwestern Austin. And later, my first job as a commercial pilot after Stephen died was as a photo pilot for the Department of Agriculture contract that I had flying out of Lago Vista, Texas. I got that job because a friend of mine, Britt, had an airplane that she wanted me to hide from her boyfriend, who was using the airplane to travel around and visit other women in Houston. And so I took the airplane out to Lago Vista to hide it from the boyfriend. And when I taxied up to her mechanic's hangar, another guy came down and asked who owned that pretty little airplane and would they be interested in selling it. And I said to Carl, the person that was asking the question, "You may have found Britt on exactly the right day, as she's trying to hide this airplane from her boyfriend." Then Carl eventually bought the airplane, and it was he that hired me to fly as a cameraman. And so that was, other than flight instruction, that was my first job as a commercial pilot. I loved my time at Lago Vista Airport. I flew out of there for about 4 or 5 years in rural Lake Travis, Texas, and it was a wonderful time in my life. In 1998, 4 years after my husband had passed away from AIDS, I moved back to Wichita, Kansas to take care of my ailing, aging mother. I was without a job, and the first day that we got her home from the hospital, I was sitting in the easy chair in the living room thinking, oh God, what am I going to do now? And I looked out in the driveway and saw there was a newspaper in the driveway. She didn't take the newspaper, but for some reason the paper boy had delivered a paper. So I thought, oh, the next thing to do is go out and get the newspaper. So I did, and there was a help wanted ad for maintenance personnel at Air Midwest Airlines, which is a subsidiary of Mesa Air Group that was based in Wichita, Kansas. I was hired as a mechanic at $9.50 an hour, and I worked the overnight shift from 10 p.m. till in the morning whenever we got done with the overnight maintenance. And it was hell, but I loved it. I was grateful to have a job. And I worked as a mechanic for 6 weeks, and there was an opening in management in a position called maintenance control. I applied for it and was suddenly, my salary doubled from $9.50 an hour to $36,000 a year. And I had an office, and I worked as a maintenance controller for 2.5 years. And then I decided I wanted to be a pilot with that company. I already had my commercial and instrument rating. I just had to do the application and pass all the flight tests. Right at the same time, they had an opening in their upper management as a director of safety. So I was promoted to being director of safety, along with becoming a first officer. The first day on the job, I was flying in August of 2001. It was the happiest day of my life, my first day as a first officer, and I was completing my what they call initial operating experience. And before I knew it, 9/11 happened, and I was furloughed for a year as a pilot, but I still had my job as a director of safety. My first flight as a captain was from Dallas, Texas to Salina, Kansas, where I took the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders in 2004 to a home game of one of the Dallas Cowboy football players. He hired the cheerleaders and chartered the airplane to go to his high school in Salina. On the way home that night, it was very late at night, and the air was just completely smooth, and we were on final approach to the DFW airport from 50 miles out. And the landing I made was so smooth, you didn't even know that we had actually touched down, except the propellers. You could hear the propeller pitch change from flight mode to ground mode, and then the airplane slowed down. When they got off the airplane, the cheerleaders all said, "Your landing was so much better than the other pilot's landing," because he landed in Salina, but there the wind was blowing 40 miles an hour. I didn't try to explain it to the cheerleaders, but we were all home safe, and that was my first flight as a captain. I enjoyed several years as a captain. On one of the flights, I heard a voice when I was going into Hobbs, New Mexico, and the voice said, "Is that Jimmer?" And I answered yes. And when I got on the ground, it was my former student, Dylan, and I had started teaching him when he was 14 years old, and now he was working as an air ambulance pilot out of Amarillo, Texas, I believe it was, and he had a flight to Hobbs, New Mexico, and we visited on the ground there in Hobbs, New Mexico. And I was so grateful to run into him. Teaching him when he was 14 years old was a look back at myself, because I started flying when I was 14 years old. One of the highlights of my career at Air Midwest was flying to the Bahamas. And the other highlight was flying to JFK. After my job at Air Midwest, I got to fly a Cessna Citation and teach in the Citation for Flight Safety International. One of the highlights of my career at Air Midwest was flying into JFK Airport in a Beechcraft 1900. The pictures you see are approaching from Long Island into JFK. You can just barely see the Empire State Building off of the end of runway 31 right on that day we approached at sunset. The Beechcraft 1900 was a fast airplane. You can see the airspeed was indicated about 220 knots. The ground speed was about 248. We're at 16,000 feet. We're headed to the northwest, and I'm descending at 500 feet per minute, and I'm about 3 feet above altitude. Anyway, on the ground at JFK, it was a lot of fun, and we mixed well with the big airplanes, even though we're a little 19-seat airplane. Our airplane would actually fit underneath the wing of the 767s we were parked next to. I had a good time with the ground personnel there in JFK, and that was the highlight of my career flying with Air Midwest. Little did I know that just a few years later, I would actually move to New York City. When I was young, before I fully understood my sexuality, I dated women and had relations with them. I may have children that I do not know about, but I decided as an adult to adopt two boys over the years, Derek on the left and me in the middle, John on the right. Derek came to me first when he was 4 years old. His mother was a single mom and needed support, so I helped raise Derek. Eventually, he graduated from high school. That's a picture of him and I on his graduation day, and his mother and he in front of my car. Later, I met John on the streets of New York City, and we had a great time together. John was 26 when I met him, and he moved into my apartment a year later, and he'll be turning 36 tomorrow. John and I went down to Texas for Derek's wedding. We had a great time, and I'm really grateful to have these two young men in my life today.